This is Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. I'm Cait Malole, and for today's topic, we will be talking about She's Beautiful When She's Angry, the 2014 documentary film chronicling the beginnings of the women's liberation movement in the United States, produced and directed by Mary Dore. The film opens up with present-day women protesting outside of a state capitol for reproductive justice. Can you guess what state it is? It starts with a T and rhymes with X's. You guessed it, Texas.
Don't mess with Texas women.
The documentary showcases the leaders behind the women's movement from 1966 to 1971. Roe v. Wade was ruled in 1973 by the United States Supreme Court. That was nearly 50 years ago. And guess what? Access to safe and legal abortion is still an ongoing issue. It's like a domino effect among conservative states, and Texas is just one of them. Just last September 2021, feminists were outraged when Senate Bill 8, which bans most abortions at approximately 6 weeks, was signed by Governor Greg Abbott. The film shows many examples of the ways the women's movement used language to promote equality for women in the workplace and their personal lives. This ranges from slogans they developed, speeches they delivered, and most notably, an outpouring of creative works including poetry, comics, and pamphlets. As Kimber Charles Pierce writes in the journal article, The Radical Feminist Manifesto as Generic Appropriation, Gender, Genre, and Second Wave Resistance, the rhetoric of radical feminist psychology, which inspired the widely touted slogan, "The personal is political," was premised on the argument that the emancipation of the self would lead to increased solidarity in the collective movement. Generic appropriation, the making over of the substantive, stylistic, and situational characteristics of a rhetorical genre, is a means by which rhetors in a subordinate position may contest domination, affirm solidarity, and gain victories within an imposed system of symbolism. The rhetorical tactic may take the form of parody, rhetorical hybrids, or as with radical feminist manifestos, mimicry performed to acquire an authoritative voice within an established order of representations. One striking moment in the film that illustrates this tactic is when activist and author Carla Jay weaponized catcalling after hearing in the news headlines about a woman who would get harassed by men on her way to work. In response, Jay organized women together and they gave men a taste of their own medicine.
So beautiful, all of them. Oh, those men, those sex objects.
There was a woman who worked in the Wall Street area. She was very well endowed, and men would wait for her outside the Wall Street train station. And they would pinch her, make sucking noises at her. And I thought, this is pretty disgusting.
Oh, wow. Look at the legs on that one.
So I organized what I rather grandly called the first national Ogling.
Those pants, they just bring out your best.
Hey, how do you like that hat over there?
Oh, what a chapeau.
Mary Dore does an excellent job at capturing the women's liberation movement. With the use of archival footage and interviews with women who were a part of the movement, Dore encourages audiences to care about the ongoing fight for not only reproductive justice, but respect. There's so much covered in this hour-and-a-half film. According to a film review by The Guardian, if you aren't already a scholar on the time period, good luck keeping track of who represents which group and what that group's key position paper is. To help us contextualize, I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Jennifer Ryan-Bryant. She is an English professor at the State University of New York, College at Buffalo, and is a former director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Interdisciplinary Unit. She teaches courses in American poetry, the American novel, women and gender studies, gender and sexuality in literature, and African American literature. Dr. Ryan-Bryant, can you tell me about the buildup of the feminist movement, and can you share with our listeners the differences between the waves of feminism?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think that modern feminism, which dates from maybe the early decades of the 19th century, is really linked to contemporary social movements. So what we think of as being the first wave of feminism, and that's primarily in the United States and England and Western Europe, would be tied to social movements like abolition. So in the United States, the first wave of feminism is really tied to abolition until emancipation in 1865. And then it's tied to other contemporary social movements like, strangely enough, prohibition. The women's movement was pretty instrumental in having prohibition passed. There was an act passed in 1921 called the Volstead Act, which meant that it was illegal to buy or sell alcohol in the United States, but it only lasted for about 12 years before it was repealed. And then first wave feminism was also tied to suffrage, of course, which is the efforts of women to gain the vote. And of course, that happened in the US in 1920. Women were finally able to get the vote at that time. And then I would say after women gained the vote in 1920, it was, I think, pretty clear that there were still a number of issues left for women to address, and that continues to be true today. So second wave feminism, I always think, starts in the 1960s. I usually tie it to the publication of Betty Friedan's study, The Feminist Mystique, in 1963. First wave feminism is tied, as I say, to these social movements, but second wave feminism is tied more to women's presence in society and their relationship to the economic world. So a lot of second wave feminists were very concerned with women's work that they do in the home being acknowledged and kind of counted as real work, but also in expanding the kinds of jobs, careers, and just types of work that are available to women outside the home. But the problem with that, I think, is that you can see from that definition that it was second wave feminism was at first promoted by white middle class women primarily. And when women of color were trying to sort of weigh in on the movement, they introduced the concept of intersectionality, and a lot of Black women and Latinas and Native women said, we've always worked outside the home. We've always been, primary wage earners and primary caretakers in the home. And so it's not that we need to have that work acknowledged as much as we need to have the range of work available to us be expanded. And so I think with the presence of women of color, particularly in the 70s and 80s, second wave feminism expands to address things like wage inequality, which continues to be a problem today, and access to education, access to different types of careers, fair access to promotion, things like that. And second wave feminism, in a way, has never stopped because these are problems that still exist. And then third wave feminism, I would say, also sort of picks up in the 1980s and is more concerned with identity politics, intersections between gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, profession, body type, able-bodiedness, all these kinds of things become concerns of third wave feminism, where feminists are tending to look at identities not as monolithic or as predicated on one or two traits, but as intersectional and predicated on a lot of traits at once. And I think in a way, the second and third waves of feminism continue. And one way you can look at maybe a fourth wave of feminism is that some people feel that we've almost moved past the term feminism to a period that we might call humanist, where we're looking not just at women's concerns and women's rights and women's identities, but also the identities and rights and concerns of all people. That we're particularly looking at minority groups whose rights have been ignored or overlooked or diminished. But I think the concept of intersectionality continues to be important. The concepts of I would say feminism and humanism have a more global, international scope now as well.
In the documentary, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, the director Mary Dore acknowledges that there wasn't total unification amongst women. One thing that I noticed in the film is that a lot of the group meetings lacked diversity. The groups that were shown consisted mainly of either working white women talking about the rights to safe legal abortion or Puerto Rican women addressing the issues of forced sterilization in their community. Do you think it was a liability for the women's movement that they struggled with this issue?
Absolutely. There has been a lot of segregation within feminist movements, I would say particularly in second wave feminism. But part of that has to do with the fact that feminist movements in part depend on geography. And particularly in cities, people tend to meet and talk with people who live in the same area that they do or who work at the same kind of job that they do. And so it happens to be sometimes that people who are in the middle class are not meeting people who are in the working class, or people who live in this part of the city aren't meeting people who live in another part of the city. And I do think that even though women have a lot of the same general concerns, like reproductive rights are a concern for all women, I think. Your example here shows that their specific attention to that issue depends upon ethnicity, economic status, and culture, and also, where they live, geography. A book that I'd recommend is Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, which actually has a chapter talking about how the government instituted a number of free clinics in inner city neighborhoods that were primarily Black. And it's exactly as your Puerto Rican women example shows here. These clinics were there to provide free healthcare for women, but one of the things that they did was sterilize women without their knowledge or consent. And so clearly that's a problem that women who lived in these neighborhoods, who were primarily Black and poor, felt was a particular concern for them, whereas women who are white and upper class want access to safe and legal abortions, which is a valid right as well. But their perspective, the place that they're coming from there, is different than someone who lives in the inner city. One thing that could have helped the women's movement from the beginning of the 60s would have been to say, okay, we have this concern. How is this concern articulated or understood differently in different parts of the country by different groups of women? That's a problem that the women's movement had, I think, from the beginning.
One notable book that they mentioned in the beginning of the film that helped push forward the women's liberation movement was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Can you discuss more about the impact that The Feminine Mystique had on the women's liberation movement?
I think part of the impact of this book was just really good timing. I mean, she published it in 1963. That was actually the same year that poet Sylvia Plath died. It's right at the height of the civil rights movement. It's on the cusp of the emergence of Black power. So there's a lot of things going on politically and socially in the US at that time. But I would say Betty Friedan's argument in that book has a lot to do with dispelling stereotypes about women. So sort of saying we've looked at women as having this aura of perfection and domestic servitude and obedience. That's kind of the feminine mystique, is this belief that women have this set of traits which allows them to run the home and then also be submissive. And she's sort of saying, it's up to us to dispel this, and our own personal experiences show us that women don't want to live this way and that they don't live this way. And we have to expand our understanding of what women do and what they are and the kind of choices they make to get rid of that idea. And so I think she set up second wave feminism really well by saying, let's look past stereotypes and look at women's real experiences. What are women actually doing in the home? What are they actually doing in the workplace? And how can we understand society differently by looking at real pictures of women's lives? So I would think, I think that a lot of ideas from second wave feminism followed from that kind of exploration.
Interested in the ways that the women's movement used language. The film introduced many different women's groups that sparked during the women's liberation movement, all with one common goal: overcome male supremacy. One of the groups was called the Red Stockings, and they introduced a really interesting manifesto that I recall reading in your English 385 Gender and Sexuality in Literature class. For listeners who are not familiar, how would you characterize it, and what was its significance?
So the Red Stockings were, I think, a fairly short-lived group. They were active in the late 60s and early 70s, primarily around New York City. And the name of the group was an imitation of a group. This was a suffrage group in England called the Blue Stockings. The Blue Stockings were a group that organized on behalf of suffrage. And they were called that because they wore inexpensive stockings that were made out of blue wool. So the women who organized this group in New York City imitated the Blue Stockings by calling their group the Red Stockings, red being a color that's associated with Marxism and socialism. So the Red Stockings Manifesto is a deliberately sort of antagonistic statement. It's supposed to, in some ways, antagonize or at least motivate its readers to act by using deliberately provocative language. So it says essentially, all of the problems that women face in society can be tied to our patriarchal society. I mean, we have a society where men traditionally have been in power and men have made the majority of institutional decisions. So the Red Stockings said, basically, if we want to change our society, we have to change the structure. And what we have to do is show men that we don't need them, essentially. And, I don't think that the Red Stockings mean that literally and 100% across the board. But what they're trying to do is to say to us, I want you to examine all the ways in which some of the decisions in your life have been made by men or have been overseen by men. These are decisions about education, about healthcare, about whatever your career or your job is. Almost everything you've done has had some kind of male influence. And so these women are trying to say, if we are genuinely going to live in a society that women have influence in, we have to recognize and do what we can to overcome patriarchy.
Dr. Ryan-Bryant, I thank you for your time.
You are very welcome.
I'm seriously disheartened by the current situation, but at the same time, I'm angry. And one of the things I learned decades ago, when we're that angry about something that bad, we take action against it.
The film ends with present-day people protesting in the streets. Men and women of all different backgrounds uniting together. What can we take away from all this? The fight for women's rights is still going on today, and you don't need to be a woman to be a feminist. Feminism is a conversation for us all, so join the movement. Be angry, be emotional, because as Mary Dore illustrates in her documentary film, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, sometimes anger can lead to beautiful change. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. As always, this is Cait Malilay. You can follow my Instagram at CAIT_MALILAY_rights for updates on future articles and episodes.